the peace. Well, our correspondent has spent the last few days in Srinagar, one of the main cities in the disputed region. Surabhi Tandon joins us now live from New Delhi. And Surabhi, tell us, what was it like for you in Srinagar, a city that was completely cut off from the world for more than a week?
I mean, not very easy, of course. I've just returned this evening after spending 5 days in Srinagar. Now, obviously, because of the curfew-like situations, our movement was very restricted. But it did change on an everyday basis because they were changing up security measures each day. The first day that I was there, for instance, restrictions were still quite heavy. Movement was restricted. There were still several no-go zones for journalists. In fact, these no-go zones remained for the entire time that I was there. But 2 days before Eid, for instance, which is on Saturday, they did ease up these restrictions, so people were allowed more free movement in certain parts of the city. Now, of course, as journalists, we were constantly carded and checked. Every time I needed to go from a neighborhood to another, we were asked where we were going, full details were taken. Sometimes the armed personnel even took photos of our press cards just to sort of keep track of where perhaps we're going or who are the journalists entering certain areas. I was also speaking to local journalists, in fact, Kashmiri journalists who've been covering protests and curfews for over a decade in this state, in Srinagar, and they were saying that this is the first time that they weren't issued curfew passes either, so their movement was also heavily curtailed. I think the other challenge we also had was the Kashmiri people, because of the blackout that they've been in and the sort of mistrust and anger that this has built, also sort of was channeled towards journalists. So it was challenging to be able to get them to speak on camera to us. Many people wanted to speak to us only off the record without being able, without giving us access to any sound or video recording. Also, several national media reports have not been corresponding to ground reality in Srinagar, and people have been watching this. So there's even more anger towards media. So that's sort of been, it was a sort of challenge dodging both the army, security, and then sometimes the anger of local people to try and
difficult, yes,
gauge constantly the situation on the ground and, of course, get our stories.
So difficult to work there as a journalist. But what about the ordinary people and families who were forced to stay inside their homes? What was it like for them? Were they allowed to go out and get food, for example? Were they able to get out and talk to each other and meet? The Indian government, for example, said it eased the restrictions during the Muslim festival of Eid. Is that true? Were those restrictions eased?
So as I was saying, the situation was actually changing every day. Now, the government of India said that it had eased restrictions for Eid, but this is not the case. What happened was that it eased restrictions 2 days before Eid, which was this Saturday. And on that day, there was movement of people, obviously also because they had to buy supplies, because for the last 4 or 5 days, they had been under complete shutdown. So a lot of people were just sort of scrambling around to get supplies because they don't know how long this blackout will last. And then, of course, in preparation for Eid, people had to buy things, food, other things that they need for the celebration. However, on Eid, the curfew-like restrictions were brought back, and in fact they were harder than they were for the entire time that I was there. In fact, the morning of Eid, there was no movement allowed, not of people walking on the streets, not of cars. So even for us to get from neighborhood to neighborhood, we had to sometimes walk with our equipment. Of course, certain places we weren't allowed to go to. In fact, on Eid, the main mosques and one of the big grounds called Eidgah, where the namaz for Eid takes place, was shut. It was under lockdown. The only mosques that were open were local mosques, but a lot of the local people that we spoke to, especially women, they all said that they weren't going to celebrate Eid this time around because of the situation, and also because they felt that it wasn't a moment to celebrate when they had just been cut off, not just from the rest of the world, but from even each other. You know, during Eid, a lot of people not living in Kashmir come back home to celebrate with their families, but in most cases, in most of such cases, people weren't even, they weren't even aware of where their family members were, you know, because there was no contact for the last 10 days. And And on Eid day itself, the people who were flying in, we met a few of them because there were no cabs or no facilities that were given to the people, even though the government claimed that it had made facilities for transport of people in Srinagar. We met people who had been walking 20 kilometers from the airport with their luggage, taking it back home, visibly very angry and frustrated that this was the situation. And then again, coming back to what some of these national reports have been saying, which was showing a completely opposite picture on the ground. So adding to the frustration and anger of people.
And
really.
talking about that, Surabhi, I'm wondering, the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, gave a speech last week, didn't he, when he tried to kind of defend that decision by his government. And the government since said that, all of this is about restoring security in Jammu and Kashmir, but in the long term, it will be better for everyone. Did people even hear Narendra Modi's message? And do they think that life will eventually be better if they're now part of India?
So the access that people have had to the outside world is through, if they have satellite TV, because cable network has also been cut off. So a lot of people have satellite TV at home, so they have been watching the news. When Narendra Modi did go live to address the nation, it was broadcast on national channels, so they did hear his speech. But the fact of the matter is that this decision has been made without not just the consent, but without even any sort of conversation with Kashmiri people or its leaders. As you've already been reporting, all opposition leaders were jailed. In fact, even small leaders of groups, separatist groups, even imams of giant mosques, the big mosques, they've all been jailed. So there's really been no conversation with Kashmiri people on this issue. So to say that this is for the good of Kashmiri people without really asking them what is it that they even think or feel, or what is the situation on the ground when you clamp down, when you have a total blackout of communication, when you shut off supplies for people, when they don't have access to ATMs, when daily wagers can't earn money, and therefore there's a sort of cumulative effect of how this is going to, how they're even going to survive. When that is the situation on the ground and you're talking about peace in the long term, development in the long term, it doesn't really add up, right?
Yeah, and do you get a sense of what will happen next? Because clearly the Indian government cannot keep people under a curfew forever. What have people been telling you about the future?
So several different things, but I think, as I've already said in all of these answers before, what is really palpable on the ground is the anger of people. Obviously, they feel betrayed. Some people told us that Article 370 was, in a sense, their only bridge to India, and that has been burned. So many people now feel sort of this complete loss, this complete sort of distance from the Indian Constitution. Also, a lot of analysts and journalists that I was speaking to have said that in Kashmir there have always been two groups, groups that are pro-separation and groups that are pro the Indian state staying with India. Now, the people who had this middle ground, who were pro-India, especially opposition leaders who had been fighting for, who had always been speaking about Kashmir being an integral part of India, have suddenly, well, some of them have been jailed, and this sort of movement has now been sidelined because they weren't asked, they weren't included in this decision. So most people that we spoke to now say that they've been pushed to the extreme, and for them there's only one way out, which is resistance. They absolutely do not agree with the decision of the Indian government. And moreover, well, rather that now that they've been pushed to the wall, they're willing to take up even more extreme measures to resist what is to come. Of course, some people also said that they're willing to take up arms now. Some analysts told us that perhaps the rise of extremism will increase after this situation. But until the Kashmir Valley until the curfew-like situations in Kashmir Valley are eased, until people have just the basic ability to switch their phones on and get in touch with people, we're not really going to know what is to come.
Surabhi Tandon, thank you very much indeed. Now, the